a psychological revenge thriller were. He was framed for her murder. Now he'll frame a ghost. The psychological war is only getting started. In part 1, she controlled the story. In part 2, he fights back. Finn Cole is done playing the victim. He's creating a new character, a lover, a conspirator, a shadow named Leo. But when you fight a ghost with a ghost, who wins? The Silent Cure, Part 2. Streaming now, exclusively on Novella Station. Witness the stunning counterattack. Subscribe to Novella Station for the full story. Like if you're Team Finn or Team Evie. Comment and tell us. Can a lie become the truth? Only on Novella Station, where every story has a twist. Chapter 9, Fallout. The positive pregnancy test wasn't a data point. It was a detonation. It leaked, of course, not to the press first, but to the police. Detective Mori's call came at 5:03 a.m., her voice stripped of all professional neutrality, vibrating with a cold, pure fury. Did you know? I was standing in my kitchen, staring at the chemical stain the CSIs had left on the floor. No, what, detective? Don't, she spat. The lab report. Evie was pregnant. I let the silence hang, a silence she would read as guilt. I was past denial, past explanation. I was in the avalanche now. No, I said the word flat. I did not know. A harsh, disbelieving laugh. The man who optimized everything, who scheduled grief. You expect me to believe you didn't notice your wife was pregnant? Or did you notice, and that was the final system error you needed to correct? She hung up. The accusation hung in the air, more potent than any she'd voiced before. This changed the pragmatic picture from a financial crime to something primal, monstrous. The public wouldn't see a logical elimination of a problem. They'd see a predator destroying his own lineage to preserve his sterile, perfect life. My phone began to vibrate with a frequency that felt seismic. Lily, Martin, unknown numbers. News alerts piled up like digital shrapnel. Exclusive. Evie Cole was pregnant. Motive deepens in Cure author case. From Iceman to baby killer. The Finn Cole story. The monster tribe was ascendant. The miserable fool narrative was incinerated in the heat of this new, horrific detail. The comments sections were infernos. My author photo was now photoshopped with devil horns, with a screaming, pixelated embryo superimposed over my heart. I didn't read them. I walked to my study, the one sanctum. The crime scene tape was gone. I sat in my chair. The pregnancy test result floated in my mind. 5 weeks. She must have known. During our dialogue about children, she had known. She had been waiting, watching to see if I would pivot, if the news would shatter my systems with joy. And I had given her a cost-benefit analysis. She hadn't just been compiling a ledger of emotional debt. She had been nurturing the ultimate rebuttal to my philosophy inside her own body. A life, unoptimized, messy, inefficient, glorious life. And she had used it as the final piece of evidence against me. The encrypted app pinged. I didn't want to look. I had to look. Unknown. The public's reaction is within projected parameters. 87% negative sentiment shift. The miserable fool persona is no longer tenable. You are now the archetype of evil. This is the pressure. Me, why this? Why include the child? The reply was instantaneous. Unknown. To make the story inescapable. To make your philosophy irredeemable. You didn't just erase me. You erased a future. Now they see the true cost of the cure. Now, there is no way back to the person you were. That man is dead. Acknowledged. A strange calm descended. The calm of a pilot whose plane has broken apart and is now in free fall. There are no more systems to manage. No more optimal paths. There was only the ground rushing up. The doorbell rang, followed immediately by a pounding fist on the heavy oak. Not media. Cops. I didn't answer. I went to the window. 2 squad cars. Mori and Alvarez. They had a paper in Mori's hand. A warrant. This was the acceleration. The plant-based stain had forced their hand. They needed to secure a conviction before the entire case looked like a setup. The pregnancy was the emotional rocket fuel to get that warrant. I watched as they breached my front door, a splintering crash that echoed through the steel and glass house. I remained in my study. I did not flee. There was nowhere to go that her story wouldn't reach. Mori appeared in the doorway, her face a mask of grim triumph. Finn Cole, you're under arrest for the murder of Evie Cole and the unlawful termination of a pregnancy. The words were legal, clinical, and they painted a picture of such profound, intimate annihilation that I felt nothing at all. You have the right to remain silent. I stood, hand to my sides. I understand. As Alvarez cuffed me, the cold metal biting in my wrists, Maury's eyes swept my study. They lingered on the framed first edition of The Silent Cure on the shelf, on the tidy, empty desk. She leaned close, her voice for me alone. All that silence, she whispered. And for what? They marched me through my shattered front door. The media swarm was a roaring, flashing beast. Microphones were thrust like weapons. I kept my head down, my father's operatic rage and my mother's performative grief somehow combining in me into this. A mute, blank-faced perp walk. This was the pace now. Not fast. Final. As they pushed me into the back of the squad car, my phone, still in my pocket, buzzed one last time. A final notification before they confiscated it. It was a calendar alert. For 9 months in the future. The title, due date. And a location. A coordinates pin. Dropped in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. The message was clear. There was no body. There would be no tiny grave. There was only a void I had created, a story I could never outrun, and a due date for a grief the world would now forever blame me for. The car pulled away. The story was complete. The ghost had won, and she had made sure I would spend the rest of my life behind bars or out, haunted by the future I had allegedly optimized into nothing. Chapter 10. Hollow Man. The county jail was a masterpiece of inefficiency. A cacophony of shouted grievances, blaring televisions, and the smell of industrial cleaner over human sweat. It was the absolute negation of my glass house. For 3 days, I was processed, printed, and placed in a holding cell with 3 other men, a symphony of uncontrolled emotion. A meth-fueled tremor in the corner, a low, constant stream of profanity from a man with face tattoos, and a kid sobbing quietly into his knees. I sat on the edge of the steel bunk, back straight, and practiced being a hole in the noise. It was the only skill I had left. My lawyer, Graham, visited, his face grim. The pregnancy changes everything, Finn. It's not just murder one anymore. They're talking about aggravated circumstances. They're going for life without parole. The DA is salivating. This is a career-making case for them. The blood wasn't blood, I said, my voice flat, which they'll argue proves premeditation. You used a substitute because you're clever, because you read forensics textbooks. It plays right into the cold, calculating monster narrative. He rubbed his temples. Your performance at the restaurant, the interview, it's seen as manipulation. The pregnancy test receipt is the kill shot. Maury found the original at the lab. It's authenticated. It was planted. By who? Your ghost. He leaned in. They're looking at you, Finn. The husband. The beneficiary. The man with the philosophy of emotional disposal. You're a prosecutor's dream. We need a miracle. A miracle. An illogical, system-breaking event. Back in the cell, the sobbing kid was gone, replaced by a vast, silent man who stared at the wall. The TV, bolted high in the common area, was tuned to a news channel. My face flashed on the screen. Then Evie's smiling. Then a sonogram graphic with a question mark over it. The cheering. From self-help to self-destruction. The cold tragedy. I was a parable now. A warning. On the 4th day, a guard barked my name. Cole. Visitor. It wasn't Graham. It was Lily. She looked like she hadn't slept in a week. She sat across from me in the scratched plexiglass booth, her eyes red-rimmed. They've pulled the book, she said without preamble. The publisher. All editions. It's being recalled from warehouses. It's over. I nodded. The silent cure was now a confessed failure, a blueprint for atrocity. Its author was in jail. Of course it was over. Finn, she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as she pressed closer to the divider. I've been getting things. I went still. What things? Emails. to my private address, with attachments. They're chapters. A cold wire threaded through my gut. Chapters of what? Of a manuscript, titled The Ghost in the Machine. It's in her voice, Finn. It's Evie's story. From her perspective, it details everything. Your conversations, the system's management, the pregnancy. Lily's face was pale with a kind of horrified awe. It's annotated, like a corrective thesis on your life. And it's devastating. It proves you were an emotionally abusive monster, but it also proves you're right about one thing. What? It proves she's alive. The air left the room. The sterile, recycled jail air was gone. I was in a vacuum. The last chapter one received, Lily whispered, her words barely audible, is dated yesterday. It describes the taste of papaya at a market in Belize. It describes the sound of geckos on a stucco wall at night. It's not a memory, Finn. It's a travelogue. The Polaroid. The cafe in Belize. She was sending me the pages of the story she was living. Why send it to you? I breathed. I'm the publicist, she said, a hysterical laugh bubbling in her throat. She's shopping her manuscript. She wants it published. She wants to tell her side of the story to the world after you're convicted. She's going to burn your legacy to the ground from a beach somewhere and get a 7-figure book deal to do it. The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it. The final, flawless move. She wouldn't just frame me. She would write the definitive true crime bestseller about it. She would be the survivor, the victor, the brilliant writer who outsmarted the monster. I would be the source material for her triumph, rotting in a cell. You have to give it to the police, I said. And say what? An anonymous source sent me the sequel to your crime? It's her word against nothing. She could just be a brilliant fraud. It doesn't prove you didn't do it. It just proves someone out there hates you enough to write a book about it. She looked at me, truly looked at me, past the inmate scrubs, past the stubble. Is it true, Finn? The things in these chapters? The scheduled grief? The cost-benefit analysis of her mother's death? I didn't answer. My silence was confirmation enough. Her face crumpled. My God. She stood up, gathering her purse. I can't be part of this anymore, Finn. I'm sorry. She left. I was returned to my cell. The system had reached its terminal state. I was a hollow man in a concrete box, and my ghost was authoring a best-selling memoir from tropical paradise. That night, lying on the thin bunk, I stared at the ceiling. The final piece clicked into place. Her motive wasn't just revenge. It was replacement. She wasn't just erasing me. She was writing over me. My book was being pulped. Hers would take its place on the shelves. My philosophy was a disgraced cult. Hers would be a celebrated survivor's manifesto. I tried to optimize her out of existence. She was doing the same to me, with infinitely more creativity and style. The guard passed, his boots echoing. I closed my eyes. For the first time, I didn't think about logic or systems or optimal paths. I thought about the papaya in Belize, the geckos on the wall, and I made a decision. The only decision left for Hollow Man. If she wanted a story, I would give her one she couldn't control. I would give her an ending so dramatically, operatically inefficient that it would break her perfect plot. I would have to become the very thing I'd spent a lifetime fleeing. I would have to become my father's rage and my mother's grief. I would have to become a spectacle. I would have to confess. Chapter 11. The Third Actor. The plan formed not as a strategy, but as a fiction. My last work. I had Graham request a single, peculiar item from my study, an old, encrypted external hard drive, when I told him contained personal financial backups. He brought it, eyeing me with weary skepticism. What it actually contained were years of digital ephemera. Tax records, yes, but also old chat logs, forum archives, drafts of my book. The detritus of a curated life. And crucially, the raw, unedited notes for the silent cure. The early chapters where I'd theorized about social proof manipulation and narrative seeding. I'd cut them for being too clinical. Now, they were my blueprint. I spent my permitted hour in the jail's law library, a grim room with 2 outdated computers under the watchful eye of a board guard. I wasn't researching case law. I was world building. I had always known about Leo. Evie had left the texts as a clue too perfect, a fictional lover for a fictional crime. But a ghost needs a body. So I gave him one. I created a social media trail. Not from scratch. That would be too easy to debunk. I retrofitted one. I found an obscure mountaineering forum I'd joined a decade ago and abandoned. My username had been Leo K, a forgotten fragment of a middle name and an initial. I'd never posted. Now, Leo K became active. Using the library computer's clunky interface, I edited timestamps on cache pages, a trick from my more technical research on digital footprints, to show private messages between Leo K and a user named Esterling over the past 18 months. The conversations were careful, intellectual at first, discussions of archival history, of the silence in historical records, then escalating to intimacy, to desperation. He's a ghost who thinks he's a god, Esterling wrote. He's planning my erasure. I need help with my own archival project. I made Leo real. I gave him a face, a stock photo of a rugged, unassuming man, pulled from a Creative Commons hiking site, reversed image search to ensure it had no prior digital life. I gave him a location, Oregon, a remote forest guide, a man used to solitude and planning. I didn't just create an affair. I created a conspiracy. The final piece was the pregnancy. In my new narrative, it wasn't mine. It was Leo's. The ultimate motive for her to vanish. Not to punish me, but to escape with her lover and their child, using my own philosophy as the murder weapon to cover their tracks. The blood wasn't just a plant. It was a signal to him. The pen by the lake? A romantic token, a dangerous keepsake he'd left behind. I was no longer the calculating killer. I was the ultimate mark. The self-help guru, so blinded by his own reflection, he never saw the real players moving in the shadows. I packaged it not as a defense, but as a counter-narrative. I wrote it in the clear, persuasive prose of my old work. I titled the document, The Optimization of a Fool, how I was engineered to take the fall. Then, I sent it into the world. Not to the police, not to my lawyer, to a true crime blogger named Marissa Cho, whose work was known for deep dives and conspiracy-adjacent theories. She had emailed me early on, her message a mix of sympathy and ghoulish curiosity. I used the jail's email system, attaching the document and the links to Leo's forum presence. Miss Cho, I wrote, you wanted the story no one else is seeing. Here it is. Check the metadata on the forum posts. Look at the patterns. The police are chasing a ghost I invented. The real ghost is a man named Leo, and he has my wife. I hit send. The system was irrevocably poisoned. The reaction was slower than the pregnancy bomb, but it was a deeper, more insidious infection. Marissa Cho didn't publish immediately. She investigated. She reached out to Leo K via the forum, an email I'd created and could now access through a proxy on the library computer. She received no reply, which she found telling. She verified the timestamps as best she could. They held up to a superficial look. Her article dropped 3 days later. The other man, Digital Ghost, suggests deeper conspiracy in cold case. It was a fissure in the bedrock of the state's story. It wasn't proof. It was plausible deniability. It was smoke where the prosecution needed clear air. Detective Mori visited me again. She looked tired. She slid a printout of Cho's article across the table. Cute, she said, her voice devoid of its earlier fury, just a flat, professional disdain. You had time to do this in the law library. You're manufacturing reasonable doubt. I'm following evidence you ignored, I said, meeting her gaze. I was no longer the hollow man. I was an author again, defending my new manuscript. You were so fixated on me as the mastermind, you never looked for a third actor. You never asked why a woman planning to run away would leave a diary, calling herself a ghost. Unless she wanted it found. Unless it was part of the script for my character. The pregnancy, Mori began, is dated 5 weeks. Conception could have occurred during her research trip to Portland a month and a half before she vanished. A trip I supported because I believed in her academic independence. A lie, but a plausible one. Evie had taken a solo trip. I'd been relieved for the silence. Maury's jaw tightened. I had introduced a virus into her clean, pragmatic picture. Now there were 2 narratives. Hers, where I was a cold killer, and mine, where I was the patsy in a love story gone rogue. The media, eternally ravenous, seized on the conflict. The story was no longer a simple tragedy. It was a puzzle, a thriller. Team Finn didn't exist, but Team Maybe There's More to This began to stir in dark corners of the internet. Conspiracy theorists dissected Leo's hiking photo. They found the forum. The seed of my fictional man took root in reality's fertile, paranoid soil. I received a new message in the encrypted app. The first in days. Unknown, a creative pivot. Inefficient, risky, but interesting. You're learning to tell a story, but you're using my characters. That's plagiarism. Finn. A thrill, cold and electric, shot through me. She'd seen it. She was engaged. I had forced her to look at my board, not just hers. Me. It's not plagiarism. It's collaborative fiction. You wrote the first draft. I'm writing the twist. Your move. For the first time, there was no instant reply. The silence was sweeter than any logic. I had taken control of the narrative. I had made Leo real. And in doing so, I had done the one thing her perfect plan couldn't tolerate. I had introduced a variable she didn't create. Chapter 12, Ghostwriter. The silence stretched for 2 days. A quiet so profound in the wake of my gambit that I could feel the gears of her plan grinding, recalculating. The noise, however, was everywhere else. Leo was trending, not nationally, but in the specific feverish ecosystems that fed on unsolved mysteries. Forums lit up with digital sleuths trying to track down the stock photo model, dissecting the mountaineering forum's archaic code to verify my doctored timestamps. Some called it an obvious hoax. Others found the hoax too perfectly tailored, too knowing. The doubt was no longer a seed. It was a crack in the foundation. My bail hearing was a circus. The prosecution, armed with the pregnancy and my calculated public performances, argued I was a flight risk of unparalleled cunning. My lawyer, Graham, newly invigorated by the haze of alternative theory, argued I was the victim of an unprecedented frame job, a public lynching based on a personality disorder masquerading as philosophy. The judge, a weary-looking man with eyes like old pennies, listened to both. He denied bail, but the language he used was different. The court acknowledges the serious and aggravated nature of the charges, he intoned. However, the emergence of alternative investigative theories presented by the defense introduces a degree of complexity that merits a rigorous pretrial process. The defendant is remanded into custody, but the court will entertain a renewed bail motion should the discovery process yield substantive evidence supporting these new assertions. It was a loss that felt like a win. The door was open a centimeter. The story was officially complex. Back in my cell, the guard tossed a manila envelope onto my bunk. Legal mail, he grunted. It was from Graham. Inside were printouts, but not legal briefs. The first was a screenshot of a publishing industry newsletter. A small item, circled in red pen. Rumor mill. A major publishing house is said to be in a 7-figure auction for a manuscript titled Project Ghost, a first-person account by a woman allegedly at the center of a recent, high-profile, missing person case. The author's identity is shrouded in NDAs, but insiders whisper the proposal is chillingly credible. Evie. She was moving forward, auctioning her story. My fictional Leo was a hiccup in her press cycle, not a derailment. The second printout was an email chain. Graham had somehow reached out to Marissa Cho, the true crime blogger. Her reply was forwarded to me. Mr. Graham, I've done more digging. Leo is a ghost. The digital trail is clever, but it's shallow. No bank records, no employment history, no family. It's a fabrication. However, and this is a big however, my source deep within the state's forensic tech unit tells me the metadata on Evie Cole's diary entries is also problematic. The file creation dates don't align perfectly with the handwritten dates on the pages. They could have been backdated. The police are aware. They're calling it a discrepancy, not evidence of forgery. But it's there. So we have 2 forgeries, yours and possibly hers. Makes you wonder who's the better writer. I stared at the words. The diary metadata was off. Evie, the meticulous archivist, had made a mistake. Or, more likely, she'd left a mistake on purpose. A tiny flaw in the perfect frame, a signature. A way to eventually prove it was all a construction when she was ready to reveal her hand. She was writing a story with an asterisk, a trap within a trap. The final item in the envelope was a single sheet of paper, folded twice. A handwritten note. Not from Graham. The writing was elegant, precise, achingly familiar. It was a photocopy. Finn, you're learning narrative. I'm proud, but you're writing in the wrong genre. This isn't a conspiracy thriller. It's a tragedy. Your tragedy. Leo is a figment. A useful one, I admit. You gave him a face. I'll give him a motive. Attached is chapter 12 of my manuscript. Consider it a peer review. Slashy. My hands were steady as I unfolded the attached pages. It was a chapter from The Ghost in the Machine. The narrative voice was chillingly intimate, addressed to the reader. And so I knew I needed a shadow. A man so unlike Finn, he would be invisible to him. I called him Leo. In my mind, he was kindness. He was chaos. He was the sound of a lived-in house, not a museum. I wrote him letters I never sent. I imagined conversations. He became so real to me that sometimes, when Finn was lecturing on emotional frugality, I would smile, thinking of Leo's imagined laugh, rich and wasteful and warm. When I decided to vanish, I knew the police would need a reason I'd run from Finn, not just to something. So I gave him Leo. I wrote the texts. I crafted the digital whisper. It was almost too easy. Finn had spent years teaching the world not to believe in messy, human passion. So when I offered them a story of it, they swallowed it whole. They needed to believe in Leo almost as much as I did. He was the proof that my heart still worked, even if it was only beating in a story. And now, I hear, Finn has tried to give my imaginary friend a driver's license. How literal of him. How sadly, predictably male. To think the only way to fight a story is with a fact. He doesn't understand that Leo is more powerful as a ghost. A ghost can be anything. A ghost is the reason everyone is now looking at my husband and seeing, for the first time, not a monster, but a man who might have driven his wife into the arms of a phantom. I stopped reading. The air was thin. She had weaponized my own fabrication. By creating Leo, I hadn't introduced a variable she didn't control. I had handed her the final, perfect piece of her thesis. I had proven myself to be exactly the kind of man who would forge an alter ego to save his skin. And in doing so, I had made her fictional lover psychologically credible. The police couldn't find Leo because he didn't exist. But the reason he didn't exist, because he was a desperate man's invention, only made her original story more potent. It was a narrative Ouroboros, eating its own tail. She had peer-reviewed my work and found it derivative. And brilliant. The guard's voice echoed down the block. Cole, you got a visitor. Again, it wasn't Graham. It was Detective Mori. She didn't sit. She stood, arms crossed, looking at me like a scientist at a failed experiment. The text went over your Leo forum evidence, she said, no emotion. It's fabricated. The timestamp edits are good, but not perfect. We found the source code, alterations. I said nothing. But we also went over Evie's diary files again, she continued. The metadata discrepancy is confirmed. The journal entries were created on a single date, 2 days before she vanished and backdated. A flicker, a flaw. So, Maury said, leaning on the word, we have 2 forgers, a husband and a wife. A matched set. She finally sat, her eyes boring into mine. Here's what I think. I think you're both lying. I think she's alive. I think this is a twisted game between 2 pathological narcissists. And I think I no longer give a damn about your philosophy or your marriage. I just want to find a body or a breathing woman and close my file. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. Oh, and your wife's manuscript? The auction closed this morning. 8-figure deal. Worldwide rights. They're fast-tracking it. Looks like someone's story is going to be a bestseller, Cole. Just not yours. She left. I was alone with the echoing slam of the door. I looked down at Evie's note in my hands. The tragedy wasn't that I was framed. The tragedy was that we were now co-authors of a nightmare, writing over each other in real time. And her publisher was bigger. My move had been check. Her next move would be checkmate. I needed to end the game before she could write the final chapter. Chapter 13, The Living Ghost. Mori's visit was the final piece of the equation. She didn't believe me, but she no longer wholly believed her own case. The ground had shifted from solid guilt to a treacherous bog of mutual deception. I had created enough smoke. Now I needed fire, not a digital ghost, a living one. I had Graham pull every string, cash in every remaining favor from my former life. We needed a man, not a myth. We needed someone to be Leo. His name was Connor. He was a semi-retired actor I'd met years ago at a corporate retreat, where he performed a one-man show about Hemingway. He was weathered, competent, and, most importantly, owed me a significant private favor from a time I'd provided him discreet, therapeutic counsel his publicist couldn't. He understood performance. He understood subtext. "You want me to be a fictional character," he said, his voice a gravelly whisper over the jail's monitored phone. "I want you to be the man she imagined." I corrected. "You've seen the news. You've seen her photo. You know the story. I need you to go to Belize, to the town I'll give you. Find her. And when you do, you tell her Leo sent you. She'll know I'm not him. She'll know you're not the idea of him. But you'll be a reality. A man, breathing the same air, speaking the words she wrote. It will fracture her narrative. She controls the story because she's the only one living it. You will become a co-star she didn't audition." There was a long pause. "This is insane, Finn. It's the only move left on the board. The police can't find her. I can't find her. But Leo can. Because Leo knows where the pieces are meant to go." I heard the slow exhalation of smoke. "What's my motivation?" "A percentage of the book deal she just landed," I said. "Think of it as royalties for bringing your character to life." Another pause, then a low chuckle. "Hell of a third act. Send the details." While Connor traveled on a passport that didn't match the Leo photo but matched his soul, I worked on the second front. I wrote a new chapter of my own, not for a blog, but for the world. I granted one more interview from jail via a secure video link. I chose not Marissa Cho, but a mainstream, respected journalist known for psychological profiles. I was done with the fringes. I needed the center. I didn't defend myself. I didn't mention Leo. I deconstructed her. Evie wasn't just my wife. I told the camera, my face drawn but calm, the calm of a man who has seen the bottom. She was my most brilliant student. She learned this silent cure not to practice it, but to understand its architecture. Her revenge isn't a crime of passion. It's a work of devastating criticism. She is proving, in the most public way possible, that a life built on emotional efficiency is a life that breeds monstrous, artistic vengeance. I am her exhibit A, her living proof. The diary forgeries, the planted clues, they're not the work of a killer. They're the work of a radical archivist, correcting the historical record by fabricating a better, more damning one. I pivoted the narrative entirely. I wasn't a murderer. I was a critic subject. She wasn't a victim. She was an auteur. She is alive, I said, my gaze steady. And she is waiting, not for rescue, but for the final review. She's waiting to see if the world will buy her masterpiece. And when they do, when her book tops the charts and I'm convicted based on her art, that will be her ultimate triumph. Not over me, but over the emptiness I championed. She will have turned my philosophy into the scaffolding for her own creative immortality. The interview aired. It was a shockwave of a different frequency. It was too meta, too psychologically convoluted for a simple murder case. It reframed the entire saga as a twisted collaboration. Talk shows debated it. Was Finn Cole a killer, a patsy, or a tragically self-aware performance artist? Was Evie Cole a victim, a villain, or a genius? The noise was the point. It was the cover for Connor's insertion. He found her in Placencia, in a stilt house bungalow overlooking the turquoise sea, just as the coordinates from her earlier taunt had suggested. He later told me, during a monitored call I claimed was with my spiritual advisor, how it went down. She was at an open-air beach bar, typing on a laptop, a half-finished manuscript, and a sweating glass of lime juice beside her. She looked tanned, healthy, vibrantly alive. Connor, wearing cargo shorts and a look of weary, knowing empathy, approached. He slid into the chair opposite her. She looked up, annoyed, then puzzled. The face wasn't familiar, but the energy was unsettlingly specific. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice the one I knew so well, now edged with a new, cautious wariness. "Evie," Connor said, his voice a perfect blend of warmth and profound sadness. "It's been a hell of a journey." She froze. Her eyes darted, not with fear of a stranger, but with the terror of a playwright seeing an actor walk on stage, speaking lines from an early, discarded draft. "Who are you?" The question was a whisper. "I'm the guy who's been reading your mail," he said, echoing a line from the forum posts I'd fabricated. "The one you built in the quiet. Finn sent me." The color drained from her face. Not the dramatic pallor of shock, but the slow seep of utter, calculated control being wrested away. "That's not possible." He figured it out. Connor continued, his performance masterful. He leaned in. "Not the police. Not the logic. The story. You taught him how to read it, in the end. He knows you're writing the final chapter. He sent me to give you a note." He slid a single piece of paper across the table. On it, I had written 3 lines. Chapter 14, The Ultimatum. 3 days after Connor's visit, I received the message. Not through the encrypted app. A physical letter delivered to Graham, who brought it to me, his face a mask of bewildered awe. The stationery was thick, cream-colored, from a hotel in Belize. Her handwriting, for the first time, showed a slight tremor. "Fiend, sending a ghost to do your living." A surprisingly poetic gambit. "I assume he's on retainer. What is it you want?" "The game, as you've interfered with it, is no longer satisfying. The ending is muddied. Tell me your terms." She was negotiating. The living ghost had worked. The reality of Connor, of a variable she couldn't write out of the script, had forced her to the table. The auteur had lost control of her cast. I had Graham arrange a secure, untraceable video call. 2 black screens, audio only. A void for our voices. It felt appropriate. Her voice came through first, clear, composed, but stripped of its former playful malice. It was all business now. "You have my attention. I want you to come home, Evie." A soft, dry laugh. "To what? A murder charge? A public dismemberment? You've made me quite the villain in your new interviews." "No, to a narrative we co-author. One with a future for both of us." Silence. I could almost hear her recalibrating. "You have 2 paths," I continued, my voice the calm, pragmatic one I use for difficult clients. It was the voice she'd hated, but it was the only authentic tool I had left. "Path 1, you stay in hiding. Your book is published. It's a sensation. But then, I release the evidence that it's a fraud." "What evidence?" A flicker of tension. Connor isn't just an actor. He's a documentarian. He has footage of the bungalow, of you, alive and well, writing your posthumous memoir. He has receipts from the local pharmacy, time-stamped from last week, for prenatal vitamins. He has the hard drive you thought you wiped, the one with the early drafts of the diary entries, complete with revision notes. I had a forensic data recovery specialist on retainer before I ever went to jail. The Leo forum was a misdirection. This is the vault. I was bluffing about the hard drive. I had no such thing. But Connor did have footage, and the pharmacy receipt was a stroke of luck he'd secured. The rest was a fiction, but a plausible one. After all, she was the archivist. She would have kept drafts. Her breath hitched just slightly. "You're lying." "Am I? Are you willing to bet your freedom and the future of that child on it?" I let that hang. "The child. The ultimate piece. If you proceed, I will burn your masterpiece to the ground and prove you committed fraud, obstruction of justice, and caused millions in wasted investigative resources. You will trade your beach villa for a cell, and the world will know you not as a brilliant victim, but as a narcissistic fabulist. The book deal will vanish. Prison awaits. And Path 2. The question was barely a whisper. Path 2 is messy, but it has a future. You come back. You tell a story, a true one, or close enough. You tell the world you suffered a psychological break, a fugue state brought on by the trauma of a failing marriage and an unexpected pregnancy. You were confused, afraid. You ran. You hid. When you saw me being accused, you were too terrified to come forward. They'll never believe that, she scoffed, but the scoff lacked force. They will if I sell it. And I will. I will be the husband who failed you, who drove you to a break with reality. I will publicly take all the real blame, for the emotional abandonment. I will recant my philosophy entirely. I will tear down the silent cure with my own hands. We become a tragedy of mutual failure, not a thriller of calculated revenge. You get sympathy, not celebrity. You get treatment, not a trial. And the police? Mori. Mori wants a closed file. She knows the case is rotten. If you reappear, alive, the murder charge against me collapses. The aggravated circumstances vanish. The worst you face is misdemeanor wasting police time, which will be plead down given the circumstances. Your return ends the circus. The DA will take the deal to make it go away. I paused, letting the architecture of the escape route solidify in her mind. You are brilliant, Evie. What you engineered. It was a work of terrible, devastating genius. I can acknowledge that now. You proved me wrong about everything. But this, I said, my voice softening, not with warmth, but with a stark, final honesty. This is the cost-benefit analysis you need to run. Not of emotions, but of survival, glory and prison, or obscurity and freedom. The vengeful ghost in the machine, or a living mother with a second chance. The silence on the line was absolute, a void filled with the static of a possible future collapsing, and another, poorer, more real one being built from its ashes. Why? She finally asked, the word stripped bare. Why give me a way out? After what I did? Because the ultimate revenge against your revenge, I said, is to refuse to play the monster you painted. It's to offer you mercy you don't deserve. It proves your entire thesis about my emotional bankruptcy wrong. And because I took a breath, the most uncalculated sentence of my life. Because I finally read your work. And as a critic, I have to admit, the protagonist you wrote for me was one-dimensional. I'm giving us both a chance for a better, more complicated character arc. Another long silence. Then the sound of a glass being set down decisively. I need 48 hours. You have 24. After that, Connor's documentary goes to Marissa Cho. The title is already chosen. The Woman Who Wasn't There, Forging a Ghost. I ended the call. I sat in the sterile visiting room, my hands steady. There was no triumph, only a hollow, echoing exhaustion and the grim satisfaction of a perfect, pragmatic solution. I had assessed her next move, calculated her desires, glory, vindication, creative immortality, and her fears, exposure, prison, losing the child, and I had constructed a trap she could only escape by walking into a cage of my design. A gilded, forgiving cage, but a cage nonetheless. The masterpiece wasn't my revenge. It was my surrender, a surrender that demanded her capitulation. I had optimized our mutual destruction into a fragile, miserable peace. It was, I realized, the first truly efficient thing I had ever done. E. You wrote a ghost to haunt me. I gave him flesh to love you. Your move, my love. Is this our happy ending? She read it. Once, twice. Her hand, usually so steady, trembled. The laptop screen, filled with her triumphant manuscript, suddenly looked like evidence. The fiction had been breached by a reality she hadn't authored. Leo was no longer her character. He was mine, and he was sitting at her table. She looked from the note to Connor's weathered, empathetic face. In his eyes, she didn't see a hired actor. She saw the embodiment of her own creation, weaponized and sent back to her. The perfect, imagined lover, now a messenger for the husband she'd framed. For the first time since this began, Evie Sterling Cole was blindsided. Not by a fact, but by a better story. The critic had been critiqued. The archivist's record had been altered. She closed her laptop with a soft, final click. Tell him, she said, her voice regaining a sliver of its old, steely composure, but it was cracked. The manuscript is already with the editors. The ending is locked. Connor smiled, a sad, knowing smile. Endings can be rewritten, darling. That's the beauty of fiction. He stood and walked away, leaving her sitting in the sun, staring at the note, the living ghost of her own design, now walking freely in her world. The reversal wasn't just sudden. It was existentially terrifying. I had finally spoken her language, and my first sentence had stolen the pen from her hand. Chapter 15. The Reappearance. She returned in the 47th hour. Not to our glass house, but to the county sheriff's office in the wan, pre-dawn light. She wore simple jeans, a plain t-shirt, and a look of shell-shocked fragility. Her hair was darker, shorter. She looked both younger and immeasurably older. The pregnancy, just beginning to show, was hidden under a loose sweatshirt. She walked in alone, presented no ID, and said to the stunned desk sergeant, "My name is Evie Cole. I believe people have been looking for me." The following 72 hours were a controlled detonation of the narrative. Maury, true to my prediction, moved with a cold, efficient fury aimed at damage control. Evie was sequestered. Her story, the refined, sanitized version we had outlined, was fed to the press through carefully coordinated leaks. Trauma, fugue, fear. The words psychotic break were floated by unnamed medical experts. It was a story designed to elicit pity, not probing questions. My release was a quieter, more bureaucratic affair. The murder charges were formally dropped. The DA, looking both relieved and vaguely nauseated, held a terse press conference citing profoundly new evidence and a priority for the well-being of all involved. The word hoax was never uttered. The system wanted this to go away as much as we did. We did not see each other. Communications went through Graham and a new, steely attorney Evie had retained. The deal was being codified. Separate living arrangements, a confidentiality agreement thicker than my book, a jointly managed trust for the child that would be overseen by a third party. We were to be legally entangled, but existentially divorced. But first, there was the final performance. A press conference was called. It was held not at the police station, but at the outpatient wing of a prestigious psychiatric hospital. The setting was the message. This was a medical matter, not a criminal one. We entered from separate doors. I wore a simple, dark suit, no tie. I looked tired, humbled. She wore a soft, dove-gray sweater dress, her hands clasped protectively over her abdomen. We did not look at each other until we took our seats at the small table, microphones bristling before us. The room was a silent pressure chamber of flashing lights. A hospital administrator spoke first, using phrases like complex dissociative state and extreme psychological distress. Then it was our turn. Evie went first. Her voice was a fragile thread, but her eyes were preternaturally clear. She read from a statement, her gaze occasionally lifting to the cameras, letting them see the haunted look we had rehearsed through our lawyers. "I don't fully remember the past weeks," she began, a masterclass in vulnerable deflection. "I remember feeling trapped. I remember being afraid. Of my life. Of myself. The pregnancy. It was a joy that somehow tipped me into a place of profound terror. I thought if I disappeared, the pressure would stop. I see now how ill I was. How my actions hurt everyone, especially Finn, who..." Her voice broke, perfectly, "who did not deserve any of this. I am so deeply sorry. My focus now is on my health and the health of our child." She bowed her head. The cameras ate it up. The narrative was solidifying. Tragic, unwell mother-to-be. Then it was my turn. I leaned into the microphone. I did not have a written statement. I looked directly into the lens. "For years," I said, my voice low and steady, "I taught a philosophy of emotional distance. I called it strength. I was wrong. It was a sickness. My sickness. I created an environment of such sterile pressure that the woman I loved felt her only escape was to vanish. I drove her to this. The silent cure is a poison. I am here today to renounce it, and every word I ever wrote or said in its name." I saw Maury standing at the back of the room, her arms crossed. Her expression was unreadable. She knew it was a performance, but even she couldn't deny its brutal effectiveness. "I failed Evie," I continued, turning my head slightly toward her. She did not meet my eye. My job now is not to explain or defend, but to support, to provide the stability and the quiet she needs to heal, to ensure our child arrives into a world of care, not calculation. We ask now for privacy, not to hide, but to heal. "Thank you." I sat back. The crescendo of shouted questions began, but we were already rising, guided by aides away from the table, out separate doors once more. The coverage was universal and uniformly forgiving. The story had completed its metamorphosis, from lurid murder mystery to psychological thriller to a sobering drama about mental health and marital failure. It was a neater, safer, more palatable tragedy. That night, in the temporary corporate apartment Graham had secured for me, the encrypted app delivered its final message. Unknown, yet competent, if sentimental, ending. You played the repentant fool quite well. The reviews are favorable. Me, it's not an ending. It's an intermission. Unknown, is that a threat? Me, it's an observation. We're linked forever now. By law, by a child, by this story. There's no cure for that. There was no reply. The app, I would learn later, had been deleted from her device. The ghost had chosen to remain in the machine we had built together. I stood at the window, looking out at a city that now saw me as a different kind of monster, a redeemed one, a pitiable one. It was a prison of a different design, but a prison nonetheless. She had her villa in the sun replaced with monitored therapy and public sympathy. I had my glass house replaced with a life of perpetual, performative penance. We had both lost. We had both, in a way, won. The game was over. The new, quieter, infinitely more complicated game of our shared life had just begun. The silence between us was no longer a philosophy. It was a sentence. Epilogue, the archive. 10 years later. The invitation was not an invitation. It was a link sent to a professional email address I used for consulting work. The subject line, Project Ghost, Final Deposit. The sender was the Sterling Digital Humanities Trust. I knew what it was before I clicked. My heart, which had learned a slower, more sustainable rhythm, did not race. It gave a single, heavy thud like a book closing. I was in my study, a real one, in a home with oak shelves and a slightly uneven floor. The windows looked out on a garden, overgrown in a way that would have once triggered my optimization protocols, but now just felt alive. Leo was at a robotics camp. His current obsession was emergent systems. How simple rules could create complex, beautiful chaos. He was 15. I clicked the link. It required a dual authentication code, which arrived via text. She had planned this, even from beyond. It was a private, encrypted digital archive. A sleek, minimalist interface. On the homepage, a title, for the record, a complete catalog. There were folders. Slash correspondence slash contained every email, every encrypted chat log, every draft of her messages to me and mine to her from the beginning of the end, including the ones I never sent. Slash evidence underscore fabricated slash held high-resolution scans of the diary pages, with layers showing her annotations, the font choices, the chemical analysis of the inks she'd mixed to mimic aging. There were digital mock-ups of the forum posts I'd later forged, with a sidebar note. His imitation was crude, but psychologically astute. He understood the need for shadow. Slash evidence underscore authentic slash was smaller. The real pregnancy test, purchased at a CVS. A photo of her mother's locket, the one she'd actually taken with her. Receipts from the bungalow in Belize. And a single security camera still of Connor, accepting an envelope from her in a San Francisco cafe 6 months before she vanished. The timestamp was undeniable. He was hers first. The ultimate sleeper agent. Slash manuscript photographs. Slash held the ghost in the machine in its entirety, but also its antecedents. Academic papers she'd never published on narrative as a weapon of justice and the architecture of victimhood. This was the genesis. The revenge was her dissertation, written in blood and headlines instead of footnotes. Slash postscript slash was the final folder. I hovered over it, then opened. There was a video file, labeled Final Interview. E Sterling Kid. Year 9. I pressed play. She was in a sunroom, different from the Belize bungalow. Plants flourished around her. She looked at peace. Thinner. Illness had etched fine lines around her eyes, but her gaze was as sharp as ever. The ovarian cancer had been swift, she'd kept it private, and it was over within a year. This was recorded in the final months. If you're seeing this, Finn, I'm gone. And Leo is old enough to understand complexity, or will be soon. This archive is not for the public. It's for the two of you, the true record. She took a sip of water, her movements deliberate. I won, and I lost. You know that. We built a cage of mutual understanding that was, in its way, more intimate than our marriage ever was. We became experts on one another, the ultimate readers. A faint, wry smile. Connor was my idea. A test. If you were capable of looking beyond your own narrative for a villain. You were. You just looked in a wrong direction. You thought he was yours. That was the point. The final proof that you could be manipulated, even in your moment of greatest cunning. She set the glass down. The pregnancy was real. It was yours. That was the one piece of the frame that wasn't a fabrication. It was the engine of everything. The life I could not, would not, raise inside the silent cure. I used it as a weapon, which is a sin I will carry. But I also used it as a reason to build a world where he could exist outside of it. She looked directly into the camera, and for a flicker, I saw the ghost of the old, ferocious love transmuted into something else. You gave him stability, the quiet he needed. I gave him the truth of mess, of passion gone wrong. He will have to synthesize that. It's a harder puzzle than any we faced. She leaned back. I am archiving this because history is not what happened. It is the story we agree to tell. We told a story to the world to survive. This is the story behind it. For you. For him. Do with it what you need. The video ended. The last folder was named /for_Leo/. It was password protected. A note beside it read, "Password, his first puzzle solution, the one with the stars." I sat for a long time in the quiet of my study. The garden rustled outside. I thought of the dark puzzle piece we'd set aside a decade ago. It had a place now. It completed a different picture. I did not feel rage, or vindication, or even grief. I felt a profound, weary sense of completion. The archive was closed. The record was straight. Later, when Leo came home, smelling of solder and adolescent energy, I didn't mention it. We ate dinner. He talked about swarm robotics. I listened. When he went to his room to code, I walked to the bookshelf. On it, sandwiched between a history of cryptography and a field guide to birds, was a single, plain black binder. Inside were the few fragments I had kept. The Encore receipt, a printout of the dedication page, the first drawing Leo ever made for me. A stark, beautiful line drawing of two tall shapes and one small one, under a sky filled with orderly, precise stars. I took the binder down. I added a single, handwritten note on a fresh sheet of paper. For Leo, when he's ready. The key is in his stars. And for the record, she was the most brilliant person I ever knew. And I loved her, even at the end, especially at the end. I slipped the note into the front of the binder and placed it back on the shelf. It was not my story to finish anymore. It was his to discover, when his own systems of logic and emotion were ready to process the beautiful, terrible, chaotic data we had left him. The silent cure was never a cure. It was an interim, a space between the trauma and the understanding. The story was over. The life, in all its quiet, complicated, and ongoing glory, was his now. And that finally was enough. Chapter 16, The Quiet Cure. 5 years is a long time for a story to fade. The world moved on. There were fresher scandals, more straightforward tragedies. The saga of Finn and Evie Cole became a footnote, a bizarre case study occasionally referenced in articles about media frenzies or factitious disorders. We moved on, too, in a manner of speaking. We lived in the same city, not in our glass house by the lake, sold at a loss to a tech CEO who liked the notoriety, but in separate, unremarkable condominiums 3 miles apart. The terms of our intricate, legal peace treaty were governed by a parenting plan of Byzantine specificity. Our son, named Leo by Evie in a final, private act of defiance that I chose to interpret as a weary joke, was the sole conduit between us. Every Tuesday and Friday at 5:15 p.m., I would arrive at her building's secure lobby. A nanny, always a different one. Evie didn't like them forming attachments, would bring Leo down. He was a quiet boy, with Evie's watchful eyes and a startling, deep focus for a child. He liked puzzles. He liked order. "Hello, Leo," I'd say. "Hello, Father," he'd reply. We'd settled on the formal term. It felt correct. We would go to the park, or to a science museum, or simply to my apartment where I'd cooked a meal following a pediatric nutritionist's guidelines. Our time was structured, calm, devoid of drama. I read him books about geology and logic. I did not teach him the silent cure. I practiced it in its truest, unintended form. I was simply, quietly present. An emotional baseline. Iraq. I heard about Evie through the legal updates and the gossip grapevine that still occasionally pulsed with our names. She had never written her book. The manuscript for The Ghost in the Machine was locked away, part of a legal settlement whose details were themselves confidential. Instead, she had quietly completed her doctorate. Dr. Evie Sterling Cole now worked as a consulting archivist for a digital museum, specializing in the recovery of corrupted or deliberately obscure data. The irony was not lost on me. She was literally repairing damaged records. We met only once, by accident, at Leo's kindergarten winter concert. He was playing a stationary shepherd in the nativity play. We stood at the back of the auditorium, separated by a dozen other parents. At the end, as the children bowed, our eyes met across the crowded room. There was no hatred there, no triumph, no love. It was the look of two veteran soldiers from a forgotten war, recognizing the same unspoken fatigue in the other's posture. She gave a single, slight nod. I returned it. That was all. The past, however, is its own kind of archive. It waits. The call came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. It was Detective Mori, retired now, her voice stripped of its old urgency, replaced with a raspy curiosity. "Cole," she said, "I'm cleaning out my files. Digitizing. Came across the box from your situation. I was helping Leo with a complex jigsaw puzzle of the solar system." "Yes. There's a loose end. A small one. That lab receipt. The pregnancy test. The one that was hand-delivered to you at the restaurant." I went still. Leo looked up, sensing the shift in my energy. I smiled at him, a practiced, calm smile. "Go on." We always assumed it was her. Part of the frame. But the timing, the way it was delivered. I ran it by a fresh set of eyes. A junior analyst who's a whiz with delivery logistics and security cameras. He got curious. I held my breath. The man who left it at the host's stand wasn't a gentleman. It was a woman, in a server's uniform from a different restaurant. Paid $50. The analyst tracked her down. She remembered. Said the person who hired her was a man. Quiet. Paid in cash. Gave a description that matches, well, it matches your friend Connor. The puzzle piece snapped into place in my mind with a soundless, devastating click. "Connor," I repeated, my voice flat. "Yeah, your hired ghost. The one you sent to find her." "Why would he do that, Cole? Why would he deliver the single most damning piece of evidence against you after you'd hired him? Unless his allegiance was always flexible." I saw it. The ultimate twist, one I had never written. Connor, playing both sides. Taking my money to be Leo, taking perhaps a promise from her, a cut of a future movie deal, a role in the adaptation, to ensure the frame held. He had been the one to slip me the pregnancy result, knowing it would drive me to the brink, knowing it would make my eventual breakdown and surrender to her narrative complete. He was the liaison, the catalyst, the true third actor. Not a lover, but a mercenary artist, ensuring the story reached its most dramatic peak. "You didn't know," Maury said, not a question. "No," I whispered. She was quiet for a moment. "Does it change anything?" I looked at Leo, his small, serious face bent over the orbit of Jupiter. I thought of Evie, in her archive, restoring lost data. I thought of the quiet, damaged life we had built from the rubble of our war. "No," I said, and it was the truth. "It doesn't change a thing. It was just another piece of the story, a darker footnote in the margin. A final proof that in our epic battle of narratives, we had both been pawns in a minor character's better plot." After I hung up, Leo held up a piece of the puzzle. It was a fragment of deep, star-studded black. "This one doesn't seem to fit anywhere, Father," he said. I took it from him. He was right. It was from a different puzzle altogether, slipped into the box by mistake. Sometimes that happens, I said, my voice steady. We just have to set the wrong piece aside and keep working with the ones we have. I placed the dark fragment on the table. Apart from the slowly forming universe, we returned to our work, the quiet rhythm of finding edges, connecting colors, building a coherent picture from the pieces we'd been given. The silent cure, it turned out, wasn't the suppression of feeling. It was the acceptance of the incomplete picture. It was the daily, pragmatic choice to build a life with the pieces that fit and to let the mysteries, the betrayals, and the brilliantly dark twists lie where they fell, gathering dust in the archive of the past. Outside, the rain fell, a quiet, steady shushing against the window, washing everything clean. Epilogue. The archive. 10 years later. The invitation was not an invitation. It was a link sent to a professional email address I used for consulting work. The subject line, Project Ghost, Final Deposit. The sender was the Sterling Digital Humanities Trust. I knew what it was before I clicked. My heart, which had learned a slower, more sustainable rhythm, did not race. It gave a single, heavy thud like a book closing. I was in my study, a real one, in a home with oak shelves and a slightly uneven floor. The windows looked out on a garden, overgrown in a way that would have once triggered my optimization protocols, but now just felt alive. Leo was at a robotics camp. His current obsession was emergent systems, how simple rules could create complex, beautiful chaos. He was 15. I clicked the link. It required a dual authentication code, which arrived via text. She had planned this, even from beyond. It was a private, encrypted digital archive, a sleek, minimalist interface. On the homepage, a title, for the record, a complete catalog. There were folders. Slash correspondence slash contained every email, every encrypted chat log, every draft of her messages to me, and mine to her from the beginning of the end, including the ones I never sent. Slash evidence underscore fabricated slash held high-resolution scans of the diary pages, with layers showing her annotations, the font choices, the chemical analysis of the inks she'd mixed to mimic aging. There were digital mock-ups of the forum posts I'd later forged, with a sidebar note. His imitation was crude but psychologically astute. He understood the need for a shadow. Slash evidence underscore authentic slash was smaller. The real pregnancy test, purchased at a CVS. A photo of her mother's locket, the one she'd actually taken with her. Receipts from the bungalow in Belize. And a single security camera still of Connor, accepting an envelope from her in a San Francisco cafe 6 months before she vanished. The timestamp was undeniable. He was hers first, the ultimate sleeper agent. Slash manuscript and photographs, slash held the ghost in the machine in its entirety, but also its antecedents. Academic papers she'd never published on narrative as a weapon of justice and the architecture of victimhood. This was the genesis. The revenge was her dissertation, written in blood and headlines instead of footnotes. Slash postscript slash was the final folder. I hovered over it, then opened. There was a video file, labeled Final Interview. A Sterling Kid. Year 9. I pressed play. She was in a sunroom, different from the Belize bungalow. Plants flourished around her. She looked at peace. Thinner. Illness had etched fine lines around her eyes, but her gaze was as sharp as ever. The ovarian cancer had been swift. She'd kept it private, and it was over within a year. This was recorded in the final months. If you're seeing this, Finn, I'm gone. And Leo is old enough to understand complexity, or will be soon. This archive is not for the public. It's for the two of you. The true record. She took a sip of water, her movements deliberate. I won, and I lost. You know that. We built a cage of mutual understanding that was, in its way, more intimate than our marriage ever was. We became experts on one another, the ultimate readers. A faint wry smile. Connor was my idea. A test. If you were capable of looking beyond your own narrative for a villain. You were. You just looked in the wrong direction. You thought he was yours. That was the point. The final proof that you could be manipulated, even in your moment of greatest cunning. She set the glass down. The pregnancy was real. It was yours. That was the one piece of the frame that wasn't a fabrication. It was the engine of everything. The life I could not, would not, raise inside the silent cure. I used it as a weapon, which is a sin I will carry. But I also used it as a reason to build a world where he could exist outside of it. She looked directly into the camera, and for a flicker, I saw the ghost of the old, ferocious love transmuted into something else. You gave him stability, the quiet he needed. I gave him the truth of mess, of passion gone wrong. You'll have to synthesize that. It's a harder puzzle than any we faced. She leaned back. I am archiving this because history is not what happened. It is the story we agree to tell. We told a story to the world to survive. This is the story behind it. For you. For him. Do with it what you need. The video ended. The last folder was named /for_Leo/. It was password protected. A note beside it read, "Password, his first puzzle solution, the one with the stars." I sat for a long time in the quiet of my study. The garden rustled outside. I thought of the dark puzzle piece we'd set aside a decade ago. It had a place now. It completed a different picture. I did not feel rage, or vindication, or even grief. I felt a profound, weary sense of completion. The archive was closed. The record was straight. Later, when Leo came home, smelling of solder and adolescent energy, I didn't mention it. We ate dinner. He talked about swarm robotics. I listened. When he went to his room to code, I walked to the bookshelf. On it, sandwiched between a history of cryptography and a field guide to birds, was a single, plain black binder. Inside were the few fragments I had kept. The encore receipt, a printout of the dedication page, the first drawing Leo ever made for me, a stark, beautiful line drawing of two tall shapes and one small one, under a sky filled with orderly, precise stars. I took the binder down. I added a single, handwritten note on a fresh sheet of paper. For Leo, when he's ready, the key is in his stars. And for the record, she was the most brilliant person I ever knew. And I loved her, even at the end, especially at the end. I slipped the note into the front of the binder and placed it back on the shelf. It was not my story to finish anymore. It was his to discover when his own systems of logic and emotion were ready to process the beautiful, terrible, chaotic data we had left him. The silent cure was never a cure. It was an interim, a space between the trauma and the understanding. The story was over. The life in all its quiet, complicated, and ongoing glory was his now. And that finally was enough. The final truth is here, and no one saw it coming. You thought you knew who was playing who. You were wrong. Part 2 delivered the twists. The double agent, the secret deal, the fragile piece, and the archive that held the last devastating key. What was your favorite moment? The confrontation in Belize? The courtroom of public opinion? Or the final reveal that changed everything you thought you knew? This is The Silent Cure, the full story, streaming only on Novella Station. If you live for every twist, subscribe for more mind-bending thrillers. Like this video to support original storytelling. Share with anyone who loves a revenge story written in blood and secrets. Comment below. What would you have done in Finn's place or Evie's? Thank you for watching. This is Novella Station, where stories don't just end, they haunt you.